This happened 4 years back. It was the middle of winter and the night was unseasonably warm, without a hint of snow on the ground. I left my apartment around 8 p.m. to go for my daily walk. I worked nights and my schedule was screwed up, hence the 8 p.m. walk, figuring I would cross the bridge into the city nearby. For further context, I'm a very tall guy who's fairly athletic, and I was in my late 20s at the time. I'd rarely had a problem walking at night, and at the time I felt safe doing so. I put on my headphones and headed towards the bridge. The first 20 minutes were uneventful. I passed by old houses, a subpar Mexican restaurant, a really good Mexican restaurant, a sketchy gas station, some newly built upscale apartments, and finally, I was at the river, enjoying the view of the bright lights over the dark flowing water, not yet frozen. I crossed the bridge into the city and hit a crosswalk button at a four-way intersection, and then noticed someone standing on the corner opposite, the only other soul I'd seen outside that night. Seemingly, she was doing nothing, and I assumed that she was waiting for an Uber to come pick her up, since she didn't seem to be waiting for the light to change. The street, ordinarily busy during the daytime, was completely silent. The light changed, and I crossed, headed in her direction. As I neared her, I noticed that she would cast glances in my direction and then look away, almost sheepishly. And she did this multiple times, and I figured that she was maybe unnerved by me. And I sympathized, figuring that it must have made her uneasy, us being the only two people on a very dimly lit street. As I passed by, I took in her outfit, mostly because I thought she looked cold, and she wore a knitted hat with tassels, a sweater that looked too thin for the winter, tight jeans, and a little plastic children's backpack on her back. I thought that maybe she was in her teens at first, but upon closer inspection, she appeared to be in her late 20s or 30s. She had short cropped, light brown hair and a pale complexion. She was skinny and was of average height. I was maybe a head taller than her, and I walked by and continued down the street. I passed by high-rise hotels on my right and left and made my way into a central park. During peak hours, this place would be packed with tourists and locals alike, but that day, at an odd hour with the pandemic in full swing, I felt like the only man in the city. I admired the brilliant display of lighted trees as I crossed through the center of the park. Then, figuring I was at a good halfway point in my journey, I made my way around an old marble and stone library back towards the bridge. As I turned the corner of the library back onto the street from which I'd come, I nearly collided with someone moving towards me. It was the same woman I'd seen not 10 minutes earlier. My noise-canceling headphones were still on, so I pulled down on one side and said something by way of apology. She said nothing in return. Instead, she stepped back from me and stood below a streetlight, not making eye contact. She stole tiny glances at me, that same tick that I'd noticed before, and I put my headphones back on and nodded goodnight and headed towards the nearest crosswalk. Reason told me that she must be headed in the direction I'd come from, since we'd nearly run into each other headed opposite ways, but some part of me whispered that she wasn't headed that way. And sure enough, when I turned to look, she was trailing closer behind me, her strides surprisingly long and energetic, and I found this odd that I continued to watch her out of the corner of my eye. Shortly after I reached the crosswalk, as I stood there waiting for the light to change, she caught up with me, passed me by, and stopped. A car went past, and as it did so, she squatted over her plastic bag a few meters from me, rifling frantically for something, looking up at me on occasion. I hit a button on my headphones, stopping my podcast so that I could hear her better. And what I found disturbing about the motion of her looking through her bag is that it struck me as fake, as though she were pretending for some reason. She was barely looking inside, and her careless motions struck me more like bad acting, and something about her motions, the way she kept looking at me, it all felt wrong. The light changed, and I began to walk quickly, but she was faster. She stood suddenly, darting past me towards the museum, swinging the half-open little pink backpack over her shoulder, and I watched her silhouette disappear into the darkness beyond the reach of the streetlights. I hoped that that was the end of that, and after a few beats of not seeing her, I let my guard fall a little, restarting my podcast. Beyond the museum was a patch of poorly lit sidewalk in front of a squat building with mirror-like windows. I wasn't far from the bridge now. As I made my way back there, I turned my head to look at the reflections of buildings and streetlights in the windows, and to my horror, a dark figure sprinted silently towards my reflection, dreamlike. I'm not sure why, maybe out of sheer confusion, but I turned to meet her as she hurtled towards me. Perhaps surprised by my sudden turn, she halted mere feet from me, staring. Her eyes were wide and looked frantic, wild, and she kept looking at my arms and then back at my face as though sizing me up. My accidental bluff had worked, and in the darkness, I suppose I must have looked more prepared to fight back than I felt. She gripped something small tightly in one hand, though she held it off to the side, and in the shadow of the building I couldn't see what it was. Seconds dragged as we stood there, staring at one another. Immobilized by fear and confusion, I waited for her to make some move, to attempt to use whatever object that she held in her hand. Just then, to my enormous relief, a car trundled slowly past. A bit of my strength returned, and over my blaring podcast I felt, more than heard, myself shouting at her, "What do you want?" And there was no reply. I slowly backed away from her, expecting her to move, and she just watched me, that same intense look on her face. I took another step back, and then another, and steadily backing away from her until I felt confident enough to turn and carefully walk away. As I reached a better lit area, I began to move faster, all the while keeping my eyes trained on her shadowy form. She stood there for some time, statuesque. Then abruptly, having spontaneously abandoned whatever plan that she may have had for me, she turned from me and, without looking for traffic, she crossed the street with long strides and disappeared around the corner of a building. Something about the casual air of it disturbed me greatly. I kept my eyes trained behind me on my walk home, afraid that she would follow me. The bridge was well lit and I saw no signs of her. And knowing that this was the only way for her to follow me and keep up on foot, I breathed a sigh of relief. I saw no more cars headed from the city and no more pedestrians out walking. Nothing happened after that. I'm not sure why, but I didn't call the cops that night. I still regret not having called, despite my roommates insisting that I do so. I just remember thinking that I wasn't sure what to say to the cops, that I hadn't really been attacked, that they wouldn't be able to find her anyway, and I made up excuses. I suppose I must have been in shock, in denial at having been nearly ambushed, especially by someone smaller than me, in my own city, so close to my apartment. And one of my roommates called the cops for me, and a cop drove through the area, but by that point, she was gone.
Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
I'd recently moved to this new place in a small suburb, which was quite remote, and about 2 hours away from other civilizations. My new neighbors' names were Greg, Eric, Alan, and Caroline. They each introduced themselves on the first day I moved there. My place wasn't all that big. It was a 2-story house, and for some reason, the master bedroom was on the first floor. The first few days I spent trying to find my way to places around the town and figuring out things, which was quite complicated despite the place only having not more than 20 people. It's a guess. Everyone seemed nice and friendly, always willing to help me out if I needed anything. Greg ran a supermarket, and when I mentioned I was looking for a job, he hired me as a cashier. I was surprised by the pay he offered me, even though his store was always almost empty. Only a fool would reject a golden offer. That was why I agreed without a second thought. About a month went by, and I don't know why I started having sleep problems. Probably because I was still not used to the whole new place yet. I tried whatever method I could find to try falling asleep, but none of them worked. With each passing day, it only got worse. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who deliberately stays up until late playing with my phone, gaming on PC, or chatting away with friends. No, I like my sleep, and the fact that neither medication nor chamomile tea was able to help me fall asleep seemed like a problem. That night, when I couldn't fall asleep and was looking out the window, I froze upon seeing something strange. Alan, with two mysterious figures, was carrying a corpse and was headed towards his house. The way I could tell she was a corpse was the state of the body, pale and on the verge of decaying. Every single one of them was almost dressed entirely in black, as if it was for the funeral. It would have been that they were about to bury the body. Perhaps she was a deceased family member he had brought back from the hospital. Either way, there seemed to be something weird and creepy about the entire thing. As I saw them disappear into Alan's home, I stood there for a few moments before closing the window and going to bed. Laying there, I couldn't stop thinking about what I witnessed, as multiple questions and suspicion arose from that. The next day, while I was working, curiosity got the better of me. When I saw Greg entering the store, I rushed to him to ask about Alan. However, my steps halted when I saw Alan entering the store behind him with some girl. Upon noticing me, he waved at me, and as he moved a bit further from the individual following him, revealing her face. A shiver ran down my spine as I recognized her face. She was the dead girl I saw last night. Unlike before, she didn't look pale. Instead, her skin was glowing and red. Who is she? I stuttered, the question as I tried to control my legs from shaking, hiding the fear creeping up on me. Alan glanced at the girl and his lips curled with an affectionate smile as he said, "This is my wife, Julie." Greg approached her and started talking in a way that seemed he knew this, which was weird because a few days after I moved in, Alan asked for dating tips. I concluded I must have been mistaken and either saw wrong that night or fell asleep and had a nightmare. I introduced myself to Julie, despite being terrified of her, and tried to act normally. Not wanting to pry more into the matter, I returned to work. Since I was only able to get 3 hours of sleep, I was feeling exhausted as hell. Greg told me he had to be somewhere and asked to close the store 2 hours before its closing time. The way he left in such a hurry made me wonder where he might be headed. Anyway, once I closed the door, I returned to my house, which was within walking distance from the store. Once I reached home, I took a sleeping pill and gulped it in one go. The pills were my last resort after everything. Because I was so tired due to lack of sleep, I couldn't go on like that. That night, I was awakened by uncontrollable thirst. I got up from bed and headed to the kitchen for some water. After drinking and returning to bed, I realized I couldn't fall back asleep. As I lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, I was reminded of the events from the previous night, and I got up and randomly walked to the window. However, as I looked outside, my eyes grew wide in terror. Just like Alan, Greg, too, was in black attire, accompanied by two people carrying a dead body. Even after they disappeared inside his house, I couldn't stop my racing heart and the feeling of suffocating fear taking hold of my body. I was about to close the window when I noticed Caroline, who instead of a still body was carrying a skeleton. The skeleton was wearing a newly bought suit, which was even more spine-chilling. For the rest of the night, I twisted and turned in my bed. When the ray of sunlight entered my room through the glass window, I got up and rushed outside. As I stood outside staring at each house, one by one, of my neighbors, I couldn't help but feel panicked. That was when I saw Caroline's house door open, and a blond man came out wearing the same outfit as the skeleton I saw. He grabbed the newspaper before he raised his head and met my eyes. Then he smiled and waved at me as if we knew each other. I grabbed my hair and pulled it in frustration and fear as I saw him leave. That was when I saw Greg heading out in sports attire with a gorgeous woman. Yes, you guessed right, she too was a corpse the night before. I felt my head spinning as I turned around and headed inside my house. There was something wrong with this town, and I didn't want to danger myself by staying a minute longer. With the help of some connections, I managed to get a temporary place where I could move to before finding a permanent place. So I called a moving truck and we started loading my stuff in there. Before I could get in the truck and leave, Eric approached me. I ignored his warning and started the truck. However, as I was about to cross the border, I remembered another truck driving at full speed in my direction. I tried to let it pass, but instead, it crashed right into me. There's no memory of what happened next, for I blacked out instantly. But when I woke up, I was at my new home with none other than my beloved wife, Christina.
My name's Abigail, and I turned 17 just yesterday. Since my father died, I've met many unfortunate incidents and traumas due to my drunkard mom's negligence. But having my brother Ethan there in that adversity through thick and thin eased some of the troubles. Mom never cared about us. She never even bothered to ask if we had eaten for the day or not. It was like we didn't matter to her, and she was the only one tormented by Dad's death. I don't remember clearly when and how we grew up like this, but before I knew it, I turned 17 and was asking my brother to give me the allowance money for the week. Mom stopped giving us money at some point, and Ethan started working at petty part-time jobs. Fortunately, she still provided us with education and hasn't kicked us out yet. Guess she did not forget that we came out of her womb. Her cold behaviors used to hurt us whenever we saw other kids receiving warmth from their mothers, but we've learned to ignore it nonetheless. I wasn't even surprised when she didn't remember my birthday this year either, but some of my friends seemed to enjoy making fun of my mom's ignorance toward us, so I was a bit annoyed. Ethan prepared a little birthday dinner just for the two of us at my favorite restaurant. I ordered all my favorite dishes, and everything was going fun. Despite knowing that my brother might have used up most of his savings to bring me to this fancy place for my birthday, I truly loved it, oblivious to the threat lurking around us. I excused myself for a bit to use the restroom, and as I was walking past a few other tables, I couldn't help but turn as I felt someone's persistent stare stinging my back, only to notice two men looking in my direction. It felt awkward and creepy, so I turned back and continued to walk to the restroom. As I was leaving the restroom area, I noticed the same men standing outside the men's room, and since I had to pass through that, I could not avoid them. I hesitated for a few seconds, but then I tried my best to put on a poker face and walked past them like a scalded cat. It was a relief that they didn't do anything, but as I walked back to my table, I could still feel their gaze on my back. Ethan smiled as he saw me coming in his direction, and as I reached there, he asked, "Is there anything else you'd like to eat?" His warmth and care always melt my worry away. So I smiled back and shook my head no. I think we should go home now. He looked at me with a concerned expression while asking, "Why? Did you not like it?" "No, brother, don't get me wrong. Everything was amazing. I enjoyed it, but don't you think it's getting late?" He looked at his wristwatch as I said that, and I knew the only reason he wanted to stay longer was to avoid Mom on such a joyful occasion. But since I felt uneasy staying at this place any longer, I did not take no for an answer. Fine, but let's stop for ice cream on the way home, he said as he called the waiter over for the check. I swear, at times like this, I feel like he's the younger sibling and not me. I still love him to death. After paying, we exited the restaurant and walked toward the subway station. But for some reason, I was still having the feeling of being watched. I turned around, and there was no one, so I thought I was mistaken. Abe, I think someone's following us. When Ethan said that, the faces of those two men flashed in my mind, making me tremble at the thought that if they were to do anything, none of us had the strength to fight back, since it wasn't just me whose body was fragile. I looked at Ethan as he squeezed my hands, trying to assure me nothing wrong could happen. But as we took a few steps further, a car stopped before us, and we were pulled inside. "Kevin, you idiot! Why did you grab the boy when we only needed the girl?" One of those men shouted at the other as they tied us while we struggled forcefully. "But brother, who would bring us the ransom money if we let go of the boy?" The other one replied. "Forget it. Let's go." They tied us to the back seat and started driving the car. "Now, you shithead, if you don't want to die, you would give us the money we want. Understand?" He pointed a gun at Ethan while saying that, and he shook his head vigorously. I could tell he was just as frightened as I was. They drove somewhere for 2 hours when one of them said he needed to pee. The other one looked annoyed, but asked him to hold it till they reached the travel stop. My mind was in a haze, and I couldn't think straight as I continued to panic. And even in that situation, I knew I was pale as death. After about half an hour, we reached a love stop where they parked the car outside. They took out the gun and held it behind our waists as one of them said, "Don't even think about trying to act over smart while you're here. If you don't want the girl to die, that is." Ethan again nodded nervously before asking, "Can I at least use the restroom?" The man looked at him suspiciously and said, "Fine, but give me everything you have with you." The other man checked his pockets and took his wallet, watch, and phone. We then headed inside, and they somehow got in with their guns without anyone noticing it. Amidst being terrified, I continued to hope for someone to see us and we could get away from them. But I don't think luck was on our side. The bossy one led me to the Del Taco and headed to the last corner seat to wait for Ethan and the other man. And as we sat there, he continued to scan me from head to toe. I could feel the lust dripping from his teeth, making me shiver at the thought of him trying something with me. About 15 minutes later, the two of them returned. "Took you long enough. If we get caught, I will shoot you too," the man sitting with me said while gritting his teeth in annoyance. "It's not my fault, brother. He was taking a crap in there," he said as they sat on the table next to us, still sticking to our sides. That was when I noticed a man entering the Del Taco. He ordered something, then sat at a distance of 4 seats from us. Those men didn't want to cause suspicions, so they tried to put up an act of looking at the menu, and a few minutes later, I felt the man looking in our direction. "I think he's getting suspicious of us. Let's go now," one of the men said, signaling us to get up. My wishes for the man to stop us went in vain as I noticed no one following us. I didn't blame him. He must have thought we all were together like a friend group or something. We were forced back inside the car, and this time they made me sit in the front with that man who was eyeing me like a hungry hyena, while Ethan was in the back seat at the gunpoint of the other man. I knew that even if either of us tried to fight back or struggle, they would be much quicker than us, so it was better than we do as they say until we get a chance to escape. And Ethan must be thinking the same. The only problem was that, while I knew they wanted money, I had no idea what they planned to do with us and how they thought of getting it. If they gave Mom an anonymous call, she would tell them to do whatever they wanted with us instead of giving them the money. While I was thinking all this, the car stopped suddenly in the middle of nowhere. I turned to look at the man sitting next to me, but judging by his irritated expression, the engine must have turned off on its own. The man asked the Kevin guy to go and check what was going on, and as they went to check, he put his hand on my inner thigh with a disgusting grin on his face. I wanted to scream, but I was scared they might kill Ethan, so I continued to look ahead as tears formed in my eyes and started falling off on their own. His hands proceeded further up when a muffling sound made me flinch at the thought of something happening to Ethan. I pushed the guy with all my might, opened the car door, and ran outside to see. My sudden act took aback the guy, but he instantly got it together and ran after me, only to find me frozen at the sight of his fellow's body lying on the ground, while Ethan was nowhere to be seen. I didn't want to, but I still hesitantly turned to see the enraged look on that man's face as he stared at his brother's corpse. My mind kept telling me to run, so I ran, but he grabbed my hair in a matter of minutes. He pinned me down on the ground and ripped the lower hem of my dress. But before he could do anything else, I saw Ethan sneaking up on him and hitting his head with the bloody wrench he had. The man didn't seem to be fazed by that hit, but as he was about to turn, a couple of hits followed the first one, making him fall to the ground. I had never seen such a ghastly look on my brother's face, as I saw blood splattering on his face and body while he punctured the man's head. He looked more frightening than any monster or devil I had ever imagined, making me shudder with horror. Even after the man died, he continued to hit him, which was now shifted from his head to his stomach. He repeatedly screamed as he tore open his guts, "You dare touch my baby sister with your filthy hands!" When finally done, he stepped back in horror as he realized his ruthless act. He stopped near the car tire, and it was as if his legs gave up when he squatted down with that cold, terrifying look on his face. I stared at the bodies of the two men. For some reason, my mind was at ease that they couldn't do anything terrible. But all the same, I was scared to death by the consequences of these murders. That was when I noticed the truck that had stopped at a distance, and I could tell it was the same man we saw at the travel stop. I couldn't help but feel bitter by looking at him, thinking that if he had helped us back then, nothing would have happened, despite knowing nothing was his fault. Ethan noticed me looking at him and followed my gaze, but the man's face turned pale as he saw my brother. He started his truck and drove away. I didn't want anyone else to notice us, so I got up and started dragging bodies to put them inside the car before anyone else showed up. Luckily, I found some water bottles inside their vehicle and a spare set of clothes, so I tried my best to wash off the blood on Ethan's body, while he continued looking at me in a daze. I asked him to change while I thought of something to cover this up. Noticing the trail of leaked fuel on the road, I remembered I saw one of them smoking, so I searched for a lighter inside the car and found it. After setting the car on fire, we didn't look back and continued walking, hoping to hitchhike. We knew we would get caught eventually, and if any of the working security cameras captured us in the act, we would indeed get arrested. So once we reached home, we planned to grab our things and run away somewhere else. That is, if we don't get caught before then.
Born in Alberta, Canada in the late 1970s, a young Mark Twitchell dreamed of directing big-budget Hollywood blockbusters. It's only fitting that Mark was born around the same time as the first Star Wars movie was released, as the series became a lifelong passion of his. So much so that in 2007, he actually directed a feature-length fan fiction movie set in the Star Wars universe named Secrets of the Rebellion. The film depicts a series of events that occur just a few days prior to those of the original film, and also happens to include a cameo from Boba Fett actor Jeremy Bulloch. Secrets of the Rebellion was shot in full but remains in post-production and is unlikely to ever see the light of day. The same goes for another short film that Mark tried to make named House of Cards, a horror movie filmed entirely in an Edmonton garage he'd rented. Yet Mark's films are forever doomed to remain in the editing phase because, aside from filmmaking, Mark seemed to foster another passion. It was one that was not only considerably more sinister, but one that would result in him being sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison. About the same time that Mark was filming a short horror movie, a 38-year-old factory worker named Johnny Altinger was on top of the world. Having recently dipped his toe back into the dating pool, he was delighted to inform his colleagues that he'd actually managed to bag a date with a woman he'd met on Plenty of Fish. Given that Johnny believed he was well past his sell-by date, we can understand how excited he might be and how eagerly he might agree to meet a woman he'd only just met online. Johnny's coworkers were happy for him and wished him luck with his budding romance, so much so that when he failed to show up for work one day and they received an email from his account telling them that he and his date had eloped to Costa Rica, they were incredibly understanding. Sure, it'd take some extra work to cover his shifts, but love is love, and Johnny deserved happiness. Needless to say, Johnny's coworkers were heartbroken when they then received a resignation letter from him via email. They'd missed him, but it sounded like he'd been caught up in something of a whirlwind romance. It was impossible not to be happy for him. The only matter that remained was getting Johnny's forwarding address so his employers could mail his final paycheck to him. But bizarrely, Johnny didn't return their emails, and the likelihood of him being content to miss out on a hefty sum of money seemed extremely slim. Finally, after weeks of waiting and worrying, a handful of Johnny's friends broke into his apartment. They harbored a great deal of suspicion regarding their friend's little Costa Rican vacation and weren't prepared to just sit back and wait for the cops to do something. Yet the break-in only worried them even further when they found Johnny's travel luggage and passport still in his home. To them, it still wasn't entirely clear what was happening yet, but they knew it certainly couldn't be good. Johnny's friends went straight to the Edmonton Police Service with their foreboding collection of evidence, and it wasn't long before a homicide investigation was officially launched. By chance, one of the individuals interviewed in relation to Johnny's disappearance was none other than our wannabe Spielberg, Mark Twitchell. It appeared that Johnny had sold his car to Mark at some point in the previous weeks, and this might prove a rather fruitful lead. Mark might well be able to provide them with an insight into Johnny's state of mind, perhaps even recall something Johnny said that might point them in the right direction. The police had no reason to believe that Twitchell was a potential suspect, but they also knew that there was no way Johnny was in Costa Rica, unless he had smuggled himself across the border. So, when Mark mentioned that Johnny had expressed a desire to take a vacation, the police immediately became suspicious. The inclusion of such an obviously false assertion was enough for the police to arrest Mark Twitchell on Halloween of 2008 as a suspect in the murder of Johnny Altinger. As part of their investigation of Twitchell's involvement in the disappearance, police seized and analyzed all of his electronic devices. They hoped to find an incriminating text message, a sinister search history, anything to prove it was Mark who was guilty of the murder. The chances of finding anything were slim, and even then, proving its implications would be another task entirely. So, we can only imagine the pure shock of law enforcement officials when they found a document on Mark's computer that was simply titled Serial Killer Confessions. The opening passage of Serial Killer Confessions read as follows. This story is based on true events. The names and events were altered slightly to protect the guilty. This is the story of my progression into becoming a serial killer. The document went on to present an account of its narrator's planning, failed first attempt, and successful second attempt to lure a man to his garage and murder him, with fake online dating profiles used as bait. It also described the process of dismembering the body and attempts to dispose of the remains. It was a thinly veiled attempt to fictionalize what had evidently been a very real murder, as the account was so horrifyingly detailed that it was quite obviously a retelling of Mark's own experiences of murdering Johnny. Slowly, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Johnny lost his life so that Mark might be able to author a better true crime story. At his trial, Mark attempted to fabricate the idea that he had murdered Johnny in self-defense, and that the serial killer confession document he had authored was merely a coincidence. Yet, he was hard-pressed to explain another document that law enforcement had recovered from his laptop, one which was titled, "A Profile of a Psychopath." Despite his own insistence to the contrary, the prosecution argued that it was Mark's attempt to deeply analyze his own bizarre behavior and personality. This second document also detailed how, in the days leading up to Johnny's disappearance, Mark had purchased knives, plastic sheeting, saw blades, and a meat cleaver, all in preparation for creating what was described as a kill room in the rented garage. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence the jury heard was the plot of Mark's short horror movie, House of Cards. They were told that the movie centered around an unfaithful husband, one that was lured to a discreet location under the pretense he was meeting a woman from a dating website. However, once he arrived, he was attacked and killed by a masked man as punishment for his infidelities. Mark hadn't just killed a man so he could write about the process more accurately. He had staged a grim reenactment of his own short film. Once these details emerged, the police were contacted by a man named Gilles Tétral, a computer company contractor who seemed desperate to talk to them regarding the Mark Twitchell trial. Gilles told investigating officers that he too had been lured to a secluded location under the pretense of meeting a young man named Sheena, whom he'd been flirting with online for the past several days. But when he arrived, he found himself ambushed by a man in a hocket mask who attempted to subdue him with a stun baton. After a violent struggle, Gilles managed to escape, but did not report the attack to police out of sheer embarrassment. It was a clear replication of Mark's modus operandi, and suddenly, it became clear that Gilles was the one Mark mentioned in the first court document, a man the media dubbed the one who got away. As the trial progressed, the prosecution slowly pieced together a picture of who Mark Twitchell really was, a violent, deranged psychopath who masqueraded as a filmmaker, using the art form to recreate violent fantasies that he would later delight in making a reality. The jury had no problem finding him guilty of first-degree murder, and in April of 2011, Mark was given the maximum sentence by Canadian law, life in prison with no parole eligibility for a minimum of 25 years. But even after his imprisonment, grim details of Mark's fascination with murder and dismemberment continued to reach the ears of the public. Apparently, Mark's favorite TV show was Dexter, a series that chronicled the life of Dexter Morgan, a man with homicidal tendencies living a double life. He works as a forensic technician for the police department during the day, but after dark, he continues his work as one of Miami's most prolific serial killers. In May 2013, it was reported that Twitchell had purchased a television for his prison cell. Twitchell stated that he had caught up on every Dexter episode that he missed since he was arrested and convicted of first-degree murder. Word of Mark's love for the show was met with such revulsion by those that heard it that Dexter's lead actor, Michael C. Hall, was confronted with the news on a live radio show up in Canada. "I would hope that people's appreciation was more than some sort of fetishization with the kill scenes," he said. "And I wouldn't stop making Dexter because someone like Mark Twitchell was fascinated by it only in that way. I try to tell myself that their fixated nature would have done it one way or the other, but it seems that Dexter had something to do with it. It's genuinely horrifying." Perhaps Michael C. Hall is correct. Perhaps Mark Twitchell had fostered a fascination with the macabre, and that had long predated his love of Dexter and was bound to hurt someone sooner or later. But there's also little doubt that the violent imagery presented in shows like Dexter have a very particular effect on some people. They act as triggers, making people like Mark want to turn their darkest fantasies into violent, permanent realities.